They said he was guilty before we even walked through those courthouse doors. A 23-year-old kid with a Marine Corps tattoo and a traffic lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The prosecutor had evidence, witnesses, and that smug smile that said this case was already decided. But when Judge Patricia Hawthorne called my brother's name that Tuesday morning, she had no idea she was about to face the sister of Corporal Daniel, Danny Rodriguez, and I wasn't backing down without a fight. What happened next made that entire courtroom understand why you never underestimate a woman defending her family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside County Traffic Court building looked like every other government facility built in the 1970s. Gray concrete walls, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick, and that particular smell of disinfectant mixed with anxiety that seems to permeate every courthouse in America. I sat next to Danny on one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs that were probably designed to make you want to plead guilty just to get out of there faster. My brother drummed his fingers against his knee, a nervous habit he'd picked up during his deployment in Afghanistan 3 years ago. The sound echoed in the nearly empty waiting area, competing with the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers from the clerk's office. Danny had been back home for 18 months now, working construction and trying to rebuild the life he'd put on hold when he enlisted at 19. The speeding ticket that brought us here should have been routine. Danny was driving home from a late shift, exhausted after working a 14-hour day on a commercial building project downtown. According to Officer Bradley Thornton's report, my brother was doing 78 in a 55 zone on Highway 92 just outside the city limits. Simple speeding ticket. Pay the fine, maybe take traffic school, move on with life. Except Officer Thornton had decided to make it personal. I remember the night Danny got pulled over because he called me at 11:47, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Maria, you're not going to believe what just happened," he'd said, and I could hear the traffic rushing past in the background. This cop, he saw my Marine Corps sticker and started going off about how military guys think they're above the law. What should have been a 10-minute traffic stop turned into 45 minutes of Danny standing on the side of a dark highway while Officer Thornton searched his truck, questioned him about where he'd been drinking, which Danny hadn't been, and made comments about how returning veterans were dangerous and unstable. The body camera footage, which we'd requested through Danny's court-appointed attorney, somehow had audio problems during the crucial 15 minutes when Thornton was running his mouth. The traffic lawyer assigned to Danny's case was a tired-looking man named Gerald Kovac, who handled about 30 cases a day and seemed to view each client as just another number on his overwhelmed docket. During our 10-minute consultation the previous week, Kovac had flipped through Danny's file while simultaneously checking his phone and told us the best we could hope for was reduced points and a smaller fine. "Look, your brother's got no priors. Clean driving record, military service," Kovac had said, not looking up from the paperwork. "But Thornton's a veteran officer, 15 years on the force, and his testimony carries weight. The radar reading is solid, and without clear evidence of misconduct, we're basically asking the judge to take your brother's word over a police officer's. That rarely happens." When I'd pressed him about the body camera issues and Thornton's obvious bias, Kovac had shrugged. He said, she said situation. Well, he said in this case. The judge will see a young guy who is driving fast and a cop who is doing his job. Military service is nice for character reference, but it doesn't erase a radar reading. I'd left that meeting feeling like we were walking into a rigged game, but Danny insisted on fighting it. "I wasn't drinking, I wasn't reckless, and I sure as hell wasn't doing 78. That cop had it out for me from the moment he saw my bumper sticker, and I'm not going to let him railroad me because I served my country." Now sitting in that courthouse waiting area, I watched my brother try to project confidence he didn't feel. Danny was wearing the one decent suit he owned, The same one he'd worn to our cousin's wedding last year and to every job interview since he'd gotten back from deployment. His hair was cut military short, his posture straight despite the nervous energy radiating off him. Anyone looking at us could tell he was a veteran just from the way he carried himself, the way his eyes automatically checked exits and sight lines, the way he sat with his back to the wall. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same bearing and awareness that had kept him alive overseas might work against him in a civilian courtroom, where being a veteran could be seen as a negative rather than a positive. Rodriguez versus State of California, docket number 47295, called the bailiff, a heavy-set man who looked like he'd been working courthouse security since before Danny and I were born. We stood up together, Danny straightening his tie one last time. As we walked toward the courtroom doors, I caught sight of Officer Thornton sitting in the witness area. He was a compact man in his early 40s with graying hair and the kind of mustache that probably looked intimidating during traffic stops, but just made him look like a reject from a 1980s cop show. When he saw Danny approaching, his mouth curved into what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. The courtroom itself was smaller than I had expected, with maybe 50 seats divided between the defendant and prosecution sides. Judge Patricia Hawthorne's bench dominated the front of the room, positioned high enough that everyone else had to crane their necks to make eye contact. A handful of other defendants waited their turn, mostly looking bored or anxious. This was routine for everyone, except us. Judge Hawthorne entered through a side door, and we all stood as the bailiff announced her arrival. She was a woman in her late 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd seen every excuse and sob story multiple times. Her black robe seemed to add gravity to her already imposing presence. "Please be seated," she said, settling behind the bench and opening the first file. "We have quite a few cases this morning, so let's proceed efficiently." The device showed the vehicle traveling at 78 miles per hour in a clearly posted 55-mile-per-hour zone. He continued with the technical details of the stop, describing how he'd initiated pursuit, activated his emergency lights, and pulled Danny over in a safe location. His account was methodical and professional, hitting all the legal requirements for a valid traffic stop. "Did you observe any signs that the defendant had been drinking or was otherwise impaired?" Prosecutor Morrison asked. "No, ma'am. The defendant appeared sober and cooperative throughout the contact." "And you're confident in your radar reading?" "Absolutely. I've been trained on this equipment for 15 years, and I test it before and after every shift according to department protocols. The reading was clear and unambiguous." When Morrison finished her questioning, Attorney Kovac stood up for cross-examination. I held my breath, hoping he'd finally show some of the fighting spirit Danny deserved. "Officer Thornton, you mentioned in your report that this stop lasted approximately 45 minutes. Can you explain why a routine speeding citation took so long to complete?" Thornton's expression didn't change, but I caught a slight tightening around his eyes. "I conducted a brief investigation to ensure there were no other violations occurring." "What kind of investigation?" "I asked the defendant some routine questions about his evening activities and conducted a visual inspection of his vehicle." "Did you search Mr. Rodriguez's truck?" "I conducted a cursory inspection for safety purposes." Kovac shuffled through his papers, clearly fishing for something. "Officer Thornton, do you recall making any comments to my client about his military service?" Morrison stood up immediately. "Objection. Relevance." "Sustained," Judge Hawthorne said, before Kovac could respond. "Move on, counselor." I could see Danny's jaw clench from where I sat. This was exactly what we had been afraid of. The one angle we had to prove Thornton's bias was being shut down before we could even explore it. Kovac tried a few more questions about the technical aspects of the radar reading and the lighting conditions on the highway, but Thornton had clearly been through this type of questioning countless times before. His answers were confident and consistent, leaving no room for doubt about his version of events. When the cross-examination ended, Prosecutor Morrison called no additional witnesses. Their case was simple and clean. Cop says defendant was speeding. Radar confirms it. End of story. "Mr. Kovac, are you calling any witnesses?" Judge Hawthorne asked. "Just the defendant, Your Honor." Danny stood up and walked to the witness stand, raising his right hand to be sworn in. I could see the slight tremor in his fingers, the only outward sign of how nervous he was. Kovac's direct examination was painfully brief. Danny testified that he'd been driving home from work, that he was tired but alert, and that he didn't believe he was traveling 78 miles per hour. When asked about the extended length of the traffic stop, Danny started to mention Thornton's comments about veterans, but Morrison's objection was sustained before he could finish his sentence. The cross-examination was brutal. Morrison attacked every aspect of Danny's testimony with surgical precision. She pointed out that he'd been working a 14-hour shift and was admittedly tired. She questioned his ability to accurately judge his speed while exhausted. She noted that it was late at night on a dark highway where speed could be easily misjudged. "Mr. Rodriguez, you served in Afghanistan, correct?" Morrison asked. And for a moment, I thought she might be acknowledging his service in a positive way. "Yes, ma'am. 11 months with the 3rd Marines." "And during your deployment, did you drive military vehicles at high speeds?" Kovac started to object, but Danny answered before he could. "Sometimes, yes, ma'am, when the mission required it." "So you're accustomed to traveling at speeds well above civilian speed limits?" "Objection," Kovac finally managed. "Relevance?" "Overruled. The witness may answer." Danny looked confused and slightly hurt. "Ma'am, I understood the difference between military operations and civilian driving. I've never had a speeding ticket or any other traffic violation." "But you admit that high-speed driving was part of your military experience and that you were tired and possibly disoriented on the night in question." I wanted to stand up and scream. They were twisting his service, making it sound like being a veteran made him more likely to be reckless rather than more disciplined and responsible. "I wasn't disoriented, ma'am. I was alert and driving safely." "Alert enough to accurately judge your speed on a dark highway after working 14 hours? The questions continued for another 10 minutes, each one designed to chip away at Danny's credibility and paint him as an unreliable witness to his own actions. By the time Morrison finished, Danny looked defeated, and I could see in Judge Hawthorne's expression that the prosecution had done their job effectively. Kovac's redirect examination was weak, focusing on Danny's clean driving record and military discipline, but the damage was done. When Danny returned to his seat beside me, I could see the resignation in his shoulders. "Closing arguments," Judge Hawthorne announced. Morrison stood up with the confidence of someone who knew they'd already won. "Your Honor, this case is exactly what it appears to be. A tired driver traveling on a dark highway after a long day of work exceeded the speed limit by a significant margin. Officer Thornton, a 15-year veteran of law enforcement, conducted a professional traffic stop and accurately recorded the defendant's speed using properly calibrated equipment."
Mr. Rodriguez seems like a fine young man with an admirable service record, but that doesn't change the facts. The radar reading speaks for itself. Kovac's closing was perfunctory, hitting the basic points about reasonable doubt and the burden of proof, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. He sat down after less than 3 minutes, and I could tell even he believed we were going to lose. Judge Hawthorne reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable. "Mr. Rodriguez, please stand." Danny stood up, his hands clasped behind his back in a position that reminded me of military attention. I stood beside him, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. "I've reviewed the evidence presented today," Judge Hawthorne began, her voice carrying the weight of official authority. Officer Thornton's testimony was clear and consistent. The radar reading provides objective evidence of the defendant's speed. While I appreciate Mr. Rodriguez's service to our country and his clean driving record prior to this incident, I cannot ignore the evidence presented by the state. I felt my stomach drop. This was it. Danny was going to be convicted, probably face a heavy fine, points on his license, and possible license suspension. Worse than the financial consequences was the knowledge that Thornton had gotten away with his harassment, that being a veteran had somehow worked against my brother instead of for him. But then something unexpected happened. Judge Hawthorne paused, looking directly at Danny with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mr. Rodriguez, before I render my verdict, I want to ask you about your military service. You served with the 3rd Marines in Afghanistan?" Kovacs started to object, probably thinking this was going to be more ammunition for conviction, but Judge Hawthorne held up her hand. "3rd Marines, yes ma'am. Helmand Province, 2021 to 2022. What was your unit designation?" Danny looked confused but answered clearly, "2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, Your Honor, Company Echo." Judge Hawthorne leaned forward slightly, and I caught something changing in her expression. "Company Echo. Were you at Forward Operating Base Martinez during Operation Ironside?" The question hung in the air like electricity. Danny's eyes widened, and I could see him processing what the judge had just asked. "Yes, ma'am. I was there for the entire operation, 6 weeks holding that position." Judge Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, staring at Danny with an intensity that made the entire courtroom fall silent. Even the bailiff seemed to sense that something significant was happening. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said finally, her voice carrying a different tone than it had during the entire proceeding, "were you present when Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Martinez was wounded during the mortar attack on September 18th? The courtroom erupted into whispers, but I barely heard them. Danny's face had gone completely white, and he was staring at Judge Hawthorne like he was seeing a ghost. "Ma'am?" he said quietly. "Are you Colonel Martinez?" Judge Martinez stood up slowly, her judicial robes suddenly seeming less like official garments and more like a uniform of a different kind. "I retired from the Marine Corps 18 months ago, Mr. Rodriguez. I've been serving as a civilian judge here in Riverside County since last year." Danny's voice was barely a whisper. "Ma'am, you saved my life that day." The judge, former Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Martinez, smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Actually, Corporal Rodriguez, you saved mine. You carried me 300 yards under fire to the evacuation point after that mortar took out our position. I spent 6 weeks in a military hospital recovering from my injuries, and I never got the chance to properly thank you." I felt my tears starting to run down my cheeks as I watched my brother straighten up even more, if that was possible. The entire courtroom was dead silent, everyone straining to hear what was happening. "Ma'am, you don't need to thank me. Any Marine would have done the same thing." "No, Mr. Rodriguez. Not any Marine would have made the choice you made that day. You stayed behind when everyone else was evacuating. You came back for me when it would have been safer to leave me behind." Judge Martinez sat back down, but her demeanor had completely changed. She was no longer the stern judicial officer who'd been presiding over traffic cases. She was addressing Danny as one veteran to another, with a respect and warmth that filled the courtroom. "Officer Thornton," she said, turning her attention to the witness area, "approach the bench." Thornton stood up slowly, clearly realizing that the dynamic in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. He walked forward with considerably less confidence than he had shown during his testimony. "Officer Thornton, in your 15 years of law enforcement, have you ever served in the military?" "No, Your Honor." "Have you received any training regarding the proper treatment of veterans during traffic stops?" Thornton's face was getting redder by the second. "Your Honor, I don't see how this relates to the speeding violation." "Answer the question, officer." "We received general training about dealing with various populations, including veterans." Judge Martinez leaned forward, and her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd commanded troops in combat. "Officer Thornton, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you make any comments to Mr. Rodriguez regarding his veteran status?"
Rodriguez about his military service during this traffic stop. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the air conditioning cycling on and off. Thornton stood there for what felt like forever, clearly weighing his options. Your Honor, I may have made some general observations about military drivers. What kind of observations? Thornton glanced toward Prosecutor Morrison, probably hoping for an objection that didn't come. Morrison looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. I might have mentioned that sometimes military personnel have difficulty adjusting to civilian driving standards. Danny made a sound beside me that was half laugh, half snort of disgust. Judge Martinez's expression had gone from warm to ice cold in the span of about 3 seconds. Officer Thornton, return to your seat. She turned back to Danny, and the warmth returned to her voice immediately. Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that your service record speaks for itself. The Bronze Star with V device that you earned during Operation Ironside reflects the kind of character and courage that this country needs more of, not less. I grabbed Danny's arm without thinking. He'd never told me about a Bronze Star. He'd never told me about saving anyone's life or staying behind under fire. Like most veterans I'd known, he'd kept the hardest parts of his service to himself. Now, Judge Martinez continued, regarding the matter before this court today, I've heard the evidence presented by both sides. Officer Thornton's radar reading indicates that you were traveling 78 miles per hour in a 55-mile-per-hour zone. My heart sank again. Even with this incredible revelation about their shared service, she was still going to convict him based on the evidence. However, she continued, and that single word changed everything. I find Officer Thornton's testimony to be less than credible given his obvious bias against military personnel. Furthermore, his conduct during this traffic stop appears to have been influenced by prejudice rather than professional law enforcement standards. She looked directly at Thornton, who was now visibly sweating despite the air conditioning. A 45-minute traffic stop for a simple speeding violation combined with what the officer himself admits were comments about military drivers suggests harassment rather than legitimate law enforcement activity. Judge Martinez turned back to Danny, and I could see the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Mr. Rodriguez, I find the prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you were traveling at the speed indicated by Officer Thornton's radar reading. Given the questionable circumstances of this traffic stop and the obvious bias demonstrated by the arresting officer, I have serious doubts about the reliability of his testimony. She paused, and the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Case dismissed. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my knees go weak with relief, and I had to grab onto Danny's arm to keep from falling over. Danny stood there in shock for a moment before a smile spread across his face that was brighter than anything I'd seen from him since he'd gotten back from deployment. "Thank you, Your Honor," he managed to say. "Thank you, Corporal Rodriguez, for your service then and for reminding me today why that service matters." As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, Judge Martinez called out one more time, "Mr. Rodriguez?" Danny turned back toward the bench. "Semper Fi, Marine." Danny's response was automatic and heartfelt. "Semper Fi, ma'am." Walking out of that courthouse felt like floating. Danny was practically glowing with relief and pride, and I couldn't stop grinning. Officer Thornton had slunk out through a side door, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Prosecutor Morrison was packing up her files with the efficient movements of someone who wanted to pretend this case had never happened. As we reached the parking lot, Danny finally spoke. "I can't believe that just happened. I can't believe you never told me about the Bronze Star." Danny shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention, even from his sister. "It wasn't something I needed to talk about. I just did what any Marine would do." Apparently, you saved a future judge's life. I carried an injured officer to safety. That's the job. That was my brother, minimizing his own heroism while standing up for what was right, whether it was on a battlefield in Afghanistan or in a traffic court in California. Some people collect medals and awards. Danny just collected the respect of the people who mattered, often without even realizing it. As we drove home, I thought about what had just happened and what it meant. Justice had been served, but not in the way any of us had expected. Sometimes the system works exactly as it's supposed to, and sometimes it takes a coincidence that seems almost too perfect to believe. But maybe it wasn't a coincidence at all. Maybe it was just proof that the bonds forged in service to something bigger than yourself don't break just because you change uniforms or retire from active duty. Maybe it was evidence that doing the right thing, even when it's hard or dangerous or thankless, creates connections that last a lifetime. Danny had saved Colonel Martinez's life in Afghanistan without knowing who she would become or how their paths might cross again. She had honored his service in that courtroom without knowing whether anyone would understand or appreciate the gesture. Both of them had simply done what they thought was right, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. By the time we got home, Danny was already planning to frame his dismissal paperwork right next to his discharge certificate. Not because he was proud of getting out of a speeding ticket, but because it represented something bigger. Recognition that his service mattered, that his character counted for something, and that there were still people in positions of authority who understood the difference between right and wrong. Officer Thornton never bothered my brother again. I heard through mutual friends that he'd been transferred to desk duty pending an internal affairs investigation into his treatment of veterans during traffic stops. Apparently, our case wasn't the first time questions had been raised about his conduct. Judge Martinez continued serving on the traffic court bench, and I'd like to think she brought the same sense of fairness and honor to every case that crossed her courtroom. She and Danny never saw each other again, but that single moment of recognition and respect was enough to remind both of them why they'd chosen to serve in the first place. As for me, I learned something important that day about standing by the people you love even when the odds seem impossible. I'd walked into that courthouse expecting to lose, prepared to support my brother through whatever consequences came next.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Instead, I watched justice happen in real time, witnessed the power of service and sacrifice to create connections across time and circumstance. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or won through violence. Sometimes they're fought in courtrooms, in classrooms, in everyday places where people have the choice to do right or do wrong. My brother had chosen to do right on a battlefield in Afghanistan, and that choice had echoed forward through time to save him in a way he never could have imagined. That's the thing about character. You never know when it's going to matter, but when it does, it matters completely. The phone call started that same evening. Danny was in the kitchen, making dinner, when his cell phone rang for the third time in an hour. He'd ignored the first two calls from numbers he didn't recognize, but this one showed a name he knew. Marcus Chin, his old squad leader from Afghanistan. "Rodriguez, you crazy son of a gun!" Marcus's voice came through the speaker when Danny finally answered. "I just heard about what happened in court today. Is it true? Did you really run into Colonel Martinez?" I watched my brother's face light up in a way I hadn't seen since before his deployment. For the past 18 months, Danny had struggled with civilian life in ways that went deeper than just finding work or adjusting to routine. He'd lost touch with most of his military friends, partly by choice and partly because maintaining those connections felt too painful when he was trying to move forward. "Marcus, how did you already hear about this?" Danny asked, settling into one of our kitchen chairs with the phone pressed to his ear. "Social media, man. Somebody in that courthouse posted about it, and it's been spreading like wildfire through veterans groups."
There's already a video of the judge talking about Operation Ironside, and people are sharing it everywhere. My stomach dropped a little. I hadn't thought about the possibility that what happened in court might become public. Danny had always been intensely private about his military service, especially the parts that involved combat or recognition. The idea of strangers discussing his Bronze Star or the rescue he'd performed made me nervous on his behalf. A video? Danny's voice carried the same concern I was feeling. Just the judge talking, not you. Someone recorded her explaining about the operation and how you carried her to safety. Danny, do you have any idea how inspiring this is to people? A veteran getting screwed over by a biased cop, then having justice served by the officer he saved years ago? This is the kind of story that reminds people why military service matters. Danny was quiet for a long moment, processing what Marcus had told him. I could see him weighing his natural inclination toward privacy against the possible positive impact of sharing his story. I didn't do anything special, Marcus. You know that. Any of us would have done the same thing. But you're the one who did it, and now people get to see what that kind of character looks like in the real world. Listen, I've been getting messages from guys in our old unit all day. Everyone wants to reconnect, wants to know how you're doing. Maybe it's time to stop hiding out and let people know you're okay. After they hung up, Danny sat in the kitchen staring at his phone for 20 minutes. I made us both coffee and waited for him to process whatever was going through his mind. My brother had always been someone who thought carefully before speaking, but his deployment had made him even more reserved, especially about anything related to his service. I'm not sure I want this kind of attention. What kind of attention? People calling me a hero, making a big deal out of something that happened 3 years ago. I just want to live a normal life, Maria. I want to go to work, pay my bills, maybe find someone to settle down with someday. I don't want to be anyone's inspiration or poster boy for veteran success stories. I understood his hesitation, but I'd also seen how isolated he'd become since returning home. Danny had thrown himself into work and tried to avoid anything that reminded him of his military service, including the friends who'd shared those experiences with him. Maybe this unexpected reconnection was exactly what he needed. What if it's not about being anyone's hero? I suggested. What if it's just about reconnecting with people who understand what you've been through? Danny looked at me with the kind of expression that reminded me he was still my little brother, despite everything he'd experienced overseas. You think I should call them back? I think you should do whatever feels right to you, but I also think you've been trying to handle everything alone for too long. The next morning brought more phone calls, along with friend requests on social media from people Danny hadn't spoken to in years. I watched him scroll through messages from former squad mates, guys from other units he'd served with, and even some civilians who'd seen the courthouse video and wanted to thank him for his service. Most of the messages were supportive and positive, but there were a few that made Danny uncomfortable. People calling him a hero, asking for interviews, wanting him to speak at veterans events or share his story publicly. Each request seemed to make him withdraw a little more. By Wednesday, the story had spread beyond military social media circles. A local news station called asking for an interview, and someone from the county government left a voicemail about recognizing Danny at an upcoming Veterans Appreciation event. My brother listened to each message with growing anxiety, clearly overwhelmed by the attention. This is exactly what I was afraid of. I just wanted to fight a traffic ticket, not become some kind of celebrity. You're not a celebrity, Danny. You're just someone who did the right thing and got recognized for it. That's not a bad thing. But it feels like it's getting out of control. People are making this into something bigger than it was. I watched my brother struggle with the attention and tried to understand what was really bothering him. Danny had always been humble about his accomplishments, but this seemed deeper than just modesty. There was something about the recognition that genuinely distressed him. That afternoon, while Danny was at work, I got an unexpected visitor. Judge Martinez, now dressed in civilian clothes that made her look less intimidating than she had in her judicial robes, knocked on our front door carrying a manila envelope. "Miss Rodriguez?"
"I'm Patricia Martinez. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but I wanted to speak with your brother privately about what happened in court." I invited her in and offered coffee, which she accepted gratefully. Sitting in our living room, she seemed more human somehow, less like the imposing judicial figure who'd presided over Danny's case. "Your brother saved my life," she said without preamble. "I know that might sound dramatic, but it's literally true. When that mortar hit our position, I was unconscious and bleeding heavily. My leg was pinned under debris, and the position was taking incoming fire from multiple directions. Most people would have evacuated with everyone else. But Danny didn't. Danny came back. He pulled me out from under that debris, applied field dressings to stop the bleeding, and carried me 300 yards to the evacuation point while taking fire the entire way. The medic said later that I would have bled out in another 10 minutes. Judge Martinez paused, looking out our window toward the street where Danny would soon be arriving home from work. "I spent 6 weeks in a military hospital recovering from my injuries. Shattered femur, severe blood loss, traumatic brain injury from the blast. When I was finally coherent enough to ask questions, I learned that the Marine who'd saved me had already rotated back to his unit. I never got his first name, never had a chance to thank him properly." "And now you found him in your courtroom?" "Random chance, cosmic coincidence, call it whatever you want. But when he said he'd been at FOB Martinez during Operation Ironside, I knew exactly who he was. There were only about 40 Marines at that position, and only one who'd stayed behind to rescue me." She reached into the manila envelope and pulled out several official-looking documents, along with what appeared to be a letter. "I brought these for Danny. His Bronze Star citation, which he probably never received a proper copy of, and his complete service record. But more importantly, I wanted to explain why what happened in my courtroom means so much to me." "Because you were able to thank him?" "Because I was able to repay him, in a small way. Your brother did something extraordinary for me in Afghanistan, something that changed the entire trajectory of my life. Without his actions that day, I never would have recovered, never would have retired from the Marines, never would have become a civilian judge. That traffic ticket case was my chance to return a favor that I never thought I'd be able to repay." Judge Martinez finished her coffee and stood up to leave, but she paused at the door. "Miss Rodriguez, I know your brother is uncomfortable with attention and recognition. That's common among people who've seen real combat. They know the difference between doing their job and being a hero, and they're usually reluctant to accept praise for actions they consider routine. That describes Danny perfectly. But I want you to understand something important. What your brother did in Afghanistan wasn't routine, and what happened in my courtroom wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about recognition, respect, and justice being served. Sometimes good people need to be reminded that their actions matter, that their character has consequences, and that doing the right thing creates ripples they may never see." After she left, I sat in our living room reading through Danny's service records, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd experienced overseas. The Bronze Star citation was particularly moving, describing his actions during the mortar attack in clinical military language that somehow made his heroism seem even more profound. "For exceptionally valorous conduct in the face of enemy fire while serving as a rifleman with Company Echo, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines during Operation Ironside. When his forward operating base came under sustained mortar and small arms fire, Corporal Rodriguez distinguished himself by remaining in the impact area to rescue a severely wounded officer. Despite incoming enemy fire and the imminent threat of additional mortar attacks, Corporal Rodriguez applied emergency medical aid and carried the wounded officer to safety, traversing 300 meters of exposed terrain while under continuous enemy observation. His decisive actions and complete disregard for personal safety saved the life of a fellow Marine and exemplified the finest traditions of military service." When Danny came home that evening, I showed him the documents Judge Martinez had brought. He read through them silently, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he carefully placed everything back in the envelope and set it on the coffee table. "She didn't need to do this," he said quietly. "I think she needed to do it for herself as much as for you." Danny nodded slowly, understanding what I meant. "It's strange, you know. I've thought about that day probably 1,000 times since it happened. I always wondered if she made it, if the evacuation was successful. You don't usually find out what happens after you hand someone off to the medics." And now you know she not only survived, but went on to become a judge who could help you when you needed it. It makes you think about connections, doesn't it? How the things we do echo forward in ways we can't predict. That evening, Danny finally started returning some of the phone calls he'd been avoiding. I listened from the kitchen as he talked to Marcus, catching up on 3 years of missed conversations, sharing updates about civilian life and work and the challenges of readjusting to life outside the military. Later, he called another former squad mate, then another. Each conversation seemed to lift some weight off his shoulders, reconnecting him to a part of himself he'd been trying to suppress since coming home. By Thursday, Danny had decided to accept one interview request from a local veteran advocacy group that wanted to use his story to highlight issues of veteran treatment by law enforcement. It wasn't about celebrating his military service, he explained to me, but about addressing the problems that other veterans might face when dealing with officers like Thornton. If sharing what happened can help other people avoid that kind of harassment, then maybe it's worth doing. The interview was conducted at the Veterans Center downtown, in a comfortable room that felt more like a living room than a media studio. The interviewer, a Vietnam veteran named Robert Kim, approached the conversation with the kind of respect and understanding that came from shared experience. "Tell me about that night when you got pulled over," Robert began. And Danny recounted the traffic stop in detail, describing Thornton's obvious bias and the humiliating experience of being treated like a criminal for having a Marine Corps sticker on his truck. "What was going through your mind during that 45-minute stop?" "Honestly, I was angry, but I was also scared. I knew this guy had it out for me from the moment he saw my Marine Corps decals. I could see he was looking for any excuse to escalate the situation, and I knew that anything I said or did could be twisted against me later." "How did it feel to be in court, knowing you were facing an uphill battle?" Danny thought carefully before answering. "Frustrating. It felt like the system was rigged against me because I was a veteran, like my service made me more suspicious rather than more credible."
And then Judge Martinez recognized you. That was surreal. I mean, what are the odds? Of all the judges and all the courtrooms, I end up in front of the officer I carried out of that bombed position 3 years ago. Robert leaned forward, engaging with the part of the story that clearly meant the most to him. "Tell me about that day in Afghanistan. What happened during the mortar attack?" For the first time in the interview, Danny hesitated. I could see him weighing how much detail to share, how much of that experience he was willing to make public. We were holding a forward position that controlled a major supply route. Intelligence suggested the area was secure, but you never really know in that kind of environment. The attack started just after dawn, mortars followed by small arms fire from multiple directions. "You were ordered to evacuate?" "Everyone was ordered to evacuate, yes. The position was compromised, and staying meant getting overrun or killed by indirect fire." "But you didn't evacuate immediately." Danny's voice got quieter, more focused. "I was moving toward the evacuation point when I heard someone calling for help. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez was trapped under debris from the first mortar impact, unconscious and bleeding heavily. Her leg was pinned and she wasn't responding." "What went through your mind at that moment?" "Nothing really. You don't think in situations like that. You just react based on your training. Leave no one behind. That's not just a motto, it's a fundamental principle. You don't abandon people, period." "Even when staying meant risking your own life?" "Especially then. Anyone can do the right thing when it's easy. Your character shows up when doing the right thing might get you killed." The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering Danny's recovery of Judge Martinez, his medical treatment of her wounds, and the dangerous journey to the evacuation point while under enemy fire. By the time they finished, even Robert seemed emotionally affected by the story. "One last question," Robert said. "What do you want people to understand about veterans, about military service, about the challenges people face when they come home?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I want people to understand that military service changes you, but it doesn't define you. It teaches you things about sacrifice and duty and taking care of each other, but it doesn't make you more or less than anyone else. When veterans come home, we're not looking for special treatment or hero worship. We just want to be treated with the same respect and fairness as everyone else." He paused, glancing toward the camera. "And I want people to understand that the actions we take matter, sometimes in ways we can't imagine. The choice I made to help Colonel Martinez in Afghanistan came back to help me in a California courtroom 3 years later. That's not karma or cosmic justice. That's just proof that doing the right thing creates connections and consequences that ripple forward through time." After the interview, Danny seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing his story had released something he'd been carrying alone for too long. We drove home in comfortable silence, both of us processing what had just happened. "How do you feel?" I asked as we pulled into our driveway. "Better," he said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "I thought talking about it would make it worse, but it actually feels better to have it out there." That weekend, the interview was published online and quickly gained traction in veteran communities across the country. Danny received hundreds of messages from other veterans sharing their own stories of bias and harassment, thanking him for speaking up about issues they'd faced but hadn't felt comfortable discussing publicly. More importantly, several law enforcement agencies reached out asking Danny to participate in training programs designed to improve interactions between police officers and veterans. What had started as a simple traffic ticket had evolved into an opportunity to address systemic problems and improve relationships between two communities that should be natural allies. 3 weeks after the court case, Danny received a letter from Officer Thornton's police department informing him that the officer had been disciplined following an internal investigation into his conduct during veteran traffic stops. While the specific details weren't shared, the letter indicated that Thornton was required to undergo additional training and would be subject to enhanced supervision during future interactions with military personnel. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" I asked after Danny showed me the letter. "Maybe. Probably not for Thornton specifically, but maybe for other veterans who get pulled over by other officers. If departments start paying attention to this stuff, if they start training their people to recognize bias, then maybe fewer people will have to go through what I went through." That night, Danny pulled out his Bronze Star for the first time since he'd been home. He held it in his hands for a long time, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of acceptance that he'd been missing before. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" he said. "What's that?" "For 3 years, I've been trying to put Afghanistan behind me, trying to move on and forget about that part of my life. But maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe those experiences are supposed to stay with me, not as burdens, but as reminders of who I am and what I'm capable of." "You think you've been running from the wrong things?" "I think I've been running from parts of myself that I should have been embracing. The discipline, the sense of duty, the willingness to help people even when it's difficult or dangerous. Those aren't problems to be solved, they're strengths to be used." A month later, Danny started volunteering with the same veteran advocacy group that had interviewed him. He began speaking at high schools about military service, not to recruit anyone, but to help young people understand the responsibilities and opportunities that come with serving something larger than yourself. He also started working with police departments, helping design training programs that would improve interactions between law enforcement and veterans. It wasn't the civilian life he had originally planned, but it was a way to use his experiences constructively, to turn what had happened to him into something that could help other people. Judge Martinez and Danny never became close friends, but they exchanged occasional emails and cards during holidays. She updated him on her work in traffic court, where she'd begun implementing reforms designed to ensure fairer treatment for all defendants, especially those from vulnerable populations. He shared updates about his advocacy work and the positive responses he was receiving from both veteran and law enforcement communities. 6 months after the court case, Danny met Sarah Williams at a veteran career fair where he was volunteering as a mentor. She was an Army veteran who'd served 2 tours in Iraq and was struggling with many of the same readjustment challenges Danny had faced.
Their first conversation lasted 4 hours, covering everything from job hunting to dealing with civilian misunderstandings about military service. They started dating slowly, both of them cautious about relationships after the isolating experience of returning home from deployment. But they understood each other in ways that didn't require explanation, sharing the particular combination of strength and vulnerability that comes from having served in combat zones.
A year later, Danny proposed to Sarah at the Veterans Center where they'd met, surrounded by friends who understood the significance of finding someone who could love both who you were before the military and who you became because of it. The engagement party was small but meaningful, attended by the friends Danny had reconnected with after his court case, several veterans he'd met through his advocacy work, and family members who'd watched him struggle and then find his way back to himself. Judge Martinez sent a card congratulating Danny and Sarah, along with a note that read, "Your actions continue to create positive ripples. Thank you for showing all of us what it means to serve with honor, both in uniform and out." Standing in our backyard watching Danny and Sarah dance to music playing from someone's phone, surrounded by people who understood and appreciated his journey, I thought about the chain of events that had brought us to this moment. A biased traffic stop had led to an unexpected court victory, which had led to renewed friendships and advocacy work, which had led to meeting Sarah and building a new kind of life. None of it had been planned or predictable. All of it had grown from Danny's fundamental character, from his willingness to do the right thing, even when it was difficult or dangerous, even when the consequences were uncertain. That's what I learned from watching my brother's story unfold. Character isn't just about the big moments of heroism or crisis. It's about the daily choice to live according to your values, to treat people with dignity and respect, to stand up for what's right even when no one is watching. Sometimes those choices echo forward in ways you never expect, creating connections and opportunities and moments of justice that seem almost too perfect to believe. But they're not coincidences or luck. They're the natural consequences of living with integrity, of being the kind of person who carries wounded officers to safety in Afghanistan and fights unjust traffic tickets in California with equal determination. Danny's Bronze Star represented one kind of courage, the kind that shows up in combat when lives are on the line, but his willingness to share his story, to connect with other veterans, to turn his experience into advocacy for positive change, represented another kind of courage that was just as important. Both kinds of courage came from the same source, the understanding that we're all connected, that our actions matter, and that doing the right thing is always worth the risk, even when the benefits aren't immediately obvious. As I watched my brother and his fiancée surrounded by friends who'd become family, I realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not a dramatic courtroom moment, or a medal, or recognition from strangers, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've lived according to your values and used your experiences to make things better for other people. The traffic ticket that had seemed like such a disaster when Officer Thornton first pulled Danny over had become the catalyst for everything good that followed. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the doorways to the best things, but only if we're willing to walk through them with courage and character intact. That night, after everyone had gone home and Danny and Sarah were planning their future together, I thought about calling Judge Martinez to thank her one more time for what she'd done in that courtroom, but then I realized she probably already knew what her actions had set in motion, and that the best way to honor her decision was to live up to the example Danny had set, both in Afghanistan and here at home. Character creates its own rewards, but those rewards often come in forms we never expected, arriving at moments when we most need them, delivered by people whose paths crossed ours in ways that seemed random but turned out to be inevitable. Danny's story proved that doing the right thing matters, that service to others creates bonds that transcend time and circumstance, and that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's just justice waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, delivered by the very people we helped when they needed us most. That's the kind of story that changes how you think about coincidence and karma and the invisible connections that bind us all together. It's the kind of story that makes you want to be better, to live with more integrity, to trust that the right thing is always worth doing, even when you can't see how it will benefit you. It's the kind of story that proves heroes aren't just people who wear uniforms or earn medals, but anyone who chooses to live with courage and character, creating ripples of positive change that spread farther than they'll ever know. 2 years after the courthouse incident, I stood in the back of a packed community center auditorium watching my brother address a room full of police recruits. Danny wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, looking more like a college professor than someone who'd earned a Bronze Star in Afghanistan, but his voice carried the authority of experience as he spoke about building trust between law enforcement and veteran communities.
When Officer Thornton pulled me over that night, he saw my Marine Corps decal and immediately assumed I was trouble. He didn't see a person coming home from work. He didn't see someone with a clean driving record and no criminal history. He saw a stereotype, and he treated me accordingly. The training program that Danny had helped develop was now being implemented in police academies across 3 states. What had started his personal experience with bias had evolved into a comprehensive curriculum addressing unconscious prejudice, de-escalation techniques, and cultural competency when interacting with military veterans. In the front row, I spotted Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, the training coordinator who'd first approached Danny about sharing his story with law enforcement. She'd been skeptical initially, concerned that a civilian criticizing police procedures might create defensive reactions rather than productive learning. But Danny's approach focused on partnership rather than confrontation, emphasizing shared values of service and protection rather than dwelling on what had gone wrong. The goal isn't to make you feel guilty about police mistakes. The goal is to help you recognize when your assumptions might be getting in the way of doing your job effectively. A veteran having a bad day isn't necessarily dangerous. Someone with military training isn't automatically aggressive. These assumptions can turn routine interactions into unnecessary confrontations. A young recruit in the 3rd row raised her hand. What should we look for instead? How do we know the difference between someone who's genuinely problematic and someone who's just having difficulties? Danny smiled, the same expression he used when neighborhood kids asked him about his military service. Great question. The answer is that you treat everyone with basic respect and professionalism until they give you specific reasons to do otherwise. Military training teaches people to follow lawful orders and respect authority. Most veterans will be more cooperative than average civilians, not less, if you approach them properly. He clicked to a slide showing statistics about veterans' suicide rates, unemployment challenges, and struggles with civilian readjustment. But you also need to understand that many veterans are dealing with invisible injuries and systemic problems that have nothing to do with their character or intentions. Someone who seems agitated might be struggling with PTSD symptoms. Someone who appears defensive might have had negative experiences with authority figures. Your job is to de-escalate rather than escalate, to build trust rather than create additional trauma. After the presentation, several recruits approached Danny with personal questions. One young man mentioned that his father was a Vietnam veteran who'd never talked about his service. A woman asked about recognizing signs of PTSD during traffic stops. Another recruit wanted to know how to connect veterans with appropriate resources if they seemed to be struggling. Watching Danny patiently answer each question, providing practical advice while maintaining appropriate boundaries, I felt proud of how he'd transformed his negative experience into something constructive. The bitter, isolated man who'd come home from Afghanistan had evolved into someone who could use his pain to help others avoid similar struggles. Lieutenant Torres approached me while Danny was still surrounded by recruits. She said, "Your brother has a gift for this." Most civilian trainers either talk down to officers or fail to understand the realities of police work. Danny gets it because he understands service, duty, and the challenges of making split-second decisions under pressure. I agreed. He's found his calling. This work has been healing for him in ways I don't think he expected. The feedback from departments using his curriculum has been overwhelmingly positive. Officers report feeling more confident in their interactions with veterans, and we're seeing measurable decreases in complaints and incidents involving military personnel. That evening, Danny and Sarah invited me to dinner at their apartment to celebrate another successful training session. Their home reflected both of their military backgrounds, with tasteful displays of service memorabilia mixed with Sarah's photography and Danny's growing collection of books on conflict resolution and community policing. "How many recruits was that today?" Sarah asked, as we sat down to a meal she had prepared from scratch. Sarah had turned out to be an exceptional cook, a skill she'd developed during her own difficult readjustment period when staying busy in the kitchen helped manage her anxiety. "About 38, Danny replied, plus about a dozen current officers who attended voluntarily."
Lieutenant Torres says the voluntary attendance is a good sign that word is spreading within departments. Any difficult questions? A few. There's always someone who wants to argue about whether veterans deserve special treatment or whether we're being too sensitive about bias issues. But mostly they're genuinely interested in learning how to do their jobs better. Sarah nodded knowingly. She'd faced similar challenges in her own advocacy work with female veterans, dealing with people who questioned whether gender-specific support programs were necessary or fair. Both she and Danny had learned to address skepticism with facts and personal experience rather than emotional arguments. "Speaking of your work," I said to Sarah, "how's the new program developing?" Sarah lit up immediately. She'd recently started a nonprofit organization focused on helping female veterans transition into civilian careers, particularly in fields traditionally dominated by men. Her own struggle to find meaningful work after leaving the Army had motivated her to address the unique challenges women faced when leaving military service. "We just received approval for our first federal grant," she said excitedly. "It's not huge, but it's enough to hire 2 part-time staff members and start offering structured mentorship programs in 6 cities." "That's incredible news," I said, genuinely thrilled for her success. Sarah had worked tirelessly to develop her program, often spending evenings and weekends writing grant applications and building partnerships with employers willing to hire and train veterans. "The best part is that we're already seeing results from our pilot program. 3 women have found permanent employment in the past month, and 2 others have started their own businesses with guidance from our entrepreneurship track." Danny reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand, pride evident in his expression. "She is going to change how female veterans are supported during transition. This program could become a national model." "Don't get ahead of yourself," Sarah laughed. "We're still figuring out how to manage the program we already have." But I could see in her eyes that she was thinking bigger, imagining the potential impact of expanding her work nationwide. Both she and Danny had discovered that their military experiences, including the difficulties they'd faced coming home, could be transformed into tools for helping others navigate similar challenges. A few weeks later, I accompanied Danny to what had become one of his most meaningful speaking engagements, a monthly meeting at the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. The audience was different from police recruits or high school students. These were men and women who'd served in conflicts spanning 6 decades, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, representing every branch of the military and every possible post-service experience. The VFW hall felt like stepping back in time, with wood-paneled walls covered in military memorabilia, faded photographs of members in uniform, and the lingering smell of coffee that had been brewing since dawn. The members who gathered for Danny's presentations were often struggling with their own civilian readjustment challenges, making his message about turning negative experiences into positive action particularly relevant. "Most of you know my story by now," Danny began, addressing the group of about 40 veterans seated in metal folding chairs. Traffic stop gone wrong, biased cop, unexpected justice in the courtroom. But what I want to talk about today isn't what happened to me. It's what we do with our experiences, good and bad, to help the people coming behind us. An older man in the front row, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, raised his hand. "Son, I appreciate what you're doing with the police training, but some of us have been dealing with this stuff for 50 years. How do you stay motivated when the problems seem bigger than any individual solution?" Danny considered the question carefully before responding. "You're absolutely right that individual actions can't solve systemic problems overnight, but they can create momentum for larger changes. When I started speaking about my experience, I thought maybe I could prevent a few other veterans from getting harassed during traffic stops. Now there are police departments in multiple states implementing new training protocols. None of us can fix everything, but all of us can contribute to making things better." A woman in her 30s, obviously an Iraq or Afghanistan veteran based on her age, spoke up from the back of the room. "What about when you get tired of being the poster boy for veteran issues? Don't you sometimes just want to live your life without having to educate everyone about military service?" "All the time," Danny admitted with a laugh that drew chuckles from around the room. "Sometimes I miss being anonymous, being able to go to work and come home without thinking about advocacy or education or representing anyone besides myself." He paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected various stages of the veteran experience.
But then I remember that I have opportunities to make positive changes that most people don't get. Not everyone has a story that resonates with civilians or gets media attention or opens doors to speak with policymakers. If I have those opportunities and I don't use them, then I'm wasting something valuable that could help other people. An elderly woman near the back raised her hand. My grandson just got back from his second deployment. He's struggling with finding work, dealing with nightmares, feeling like he doesn't fit in anywhere. What do you tell young veterans who feel lost? Danny's expression grew more serious. I tell them that feeling lost is normal, that most of us go through it, and that it doesn't mean anything is permanently wrong with them. Military service gives you skills and perspectives that are valuable in civilian life, but it takes time to figure out how to translate those into opportunities. He gestured toward me sitting in the audience. My sister will tell you that I was pretty much a mess for the first year after I got back. Angry, isolated, convinced that nobody understood what I had been through or what I had to offer. It wasn't until I was forced to fight for something I believed in that I started figuring out how to use my military experience constructively. What changed for you? I stopped trying to forget about my military experience and started embracing it as part of who I am. The discipline, the sense of duty, the willingness to serve something bigger than myself, those aren't problems to be overcome. They're strengths to be developed and applied in new contexts. After the meeting, several veterans approached Danny for individual conversations. Some wanted advice about dealing with their own encounters with law enforcement. Others asked about opportunities to get involved in advocacy work. A few simply wanted to thank him for giving them hope that their service experiences could be valuable in civilian life. Driving home that evening, Danny was quieter than usual, processing the conversations he'd had with veterans at various stages of their post-service journeys. Difficult questions tonight, I observed. They always are. Veterans don't ask easy questions because they're dealing with complicated problems. But that's what makes these conversations worthwhile. These aren't abstract policy discussions. They're real people trying to figure out how to build meaningful lives after serving their country. Do you ever worry that you're taking on too much responsibility? That people are looking to you for answers you don't have?
Danny considered this. Sometimes. But I think that's why it's important to be honest about my own struggles and limitations. I'm not selling anyone a magic solution or pretending that advocacy work will solve all their problems. I'm just sharing what worked for me and encouraging people to find their own ways to use their experiences constructively. That spring, Danny received an invitation that surprised both of us. Judge Martinez was receiving a Civilian Service Award from the State Bar Association, and she'd requested that Danny introduce her at the ceremony. The event was being held at a downtown hotel ballroom with an audience of judges, attorneys, and legal professionals from across the region. I've never spoken at anything this formal, Danny confided as we drove to the hotel. He was wearing his best suit, the same one he'd gotten married in 6 months earlier, and he'd spent hours preparing remarks that would honor Judge Martinez while being appropriate for a legal audience. You've spoken to police recruits, veteran groups, high school students, and congressional staff members, I reminded him. A room full of lawyers isn't going to be more intimidating than any of those groups. But those were all situations where I was talking about my own experiences. This is about honoring someone else's career and accomplishments. That's different. The ballroom was elegantly decorated, with round tables draped in white linens and centerpieces that probably cost more than Danny's monthly rent. We were seated at a table near the front, with Judge Martinez's family members and longtime colleagues. The atmosphere was formal but warm, celebrating someone who'd clearly earned deep respect throughout her career. When Danny was introduced, he walked to the podium with the same confident bearing I'd seen him display in courtrooms and training sessions. But this time, there was something additional in his demeanor, a sense of gratitude and reverence that reflected his personal connection to the woman he was honoring. 3 years ago, I walked into Judge Martinez's courtroom expecting to lose, Danny began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system. I was a veteran who'd been harassed by a biased police officer, facing a traffic citation that seemed impossible to beat. I had a court-appointed attorney who'd already given up, evidence that seemed overwhelming, and a system that appeared stacked against me. He paused, making eye contact with Judge Martinez at the head table. What I didn't know was that I was about to face a judge who embodied everything our legal system is supposed to represent: fairness, integrity, and the courage to do what is right, even when it's difficult. Danny went on to describe Judge Martinez's military service, her transition to civilian law, and her reputation for treating every case and every person with equal respect and attention. He spoke about her commitment to justice, her mentorship of younger lawyers, and her advocacy for court reforms that improved access to legal services for underserved populations. But what I want to focus on tonight, Danny continued, is something that goes beyond professional accomplishments. Judge Martinez represents the best of what public service can be. She is someone who has used every position she has held, military and civilian, to make life better for other people. He described her judicial philosophy, her approach to criminal justice reform, and her work with veteran advocacy organizations. But he also spoke about the personal qualities that made her exceptional: her willingness to listen, her commitment to learning, and her ability to see people as individuals rather than cases or statistics. When Judge Martinez recognized me in her courtroom, she could have simply noted the coincidence and moved on. Instead, she took the time to understand what had really happened during my traffic stop, to recognize the bias I'd encountered, and to ensure that justice was served. That decision changed my life, but more importantly, it reflected who she is as a person and as a judge. Danny concluded by noting that Judge Martinez's award was recognition not just of her individual achievements, but of the principle that public service, done with integrity and compassion, can transform both institutions and individual lives. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, reflecting genuine appreciation for both Danny's remarks and Judge Martinez's career. Several people approached our table afterward to compliment Danny's speech and to ask about his own advocacy work. But the moment that mattered most came when Judge Martinez herself stopped by our table as the evening was ending. "Danny, that was beautiful," she said, genuine emotion in her voice. "Thank you for those words, and thank you for everything you've done since our paths crossed again. Your work with law enforcement training has made a real difference, and I hear about your impact everywhere I go. Thank you for giving me the chance to turn a negative experience into something positive. That night in your courtroom changed everything for me." "You changed everything for yourself. I just recognized what was already there." 6 months later, Danny received a call that would test everything he'd learned about advocacy and public service. A young Marine named Kevin Walsh had been shot and killed by police during a mental health crisis in a city 2 hours away. The incident had sparked protests and calls for justice, but it had also created deep divisions between veteran communities and local law enforcement. The Walsh family had contacted Danny after seeing news coverage of his police training work, asking him to help them navigate the complex intersection of veteran issues, mental health advocacy, and police accountability. The situation was more complicated and emotionally charged than anything Danny had previously been involved in. "This isn't like training recruits or speaking at veteran meetings," Danny told Sarah and me over dinner after his first conversation with the Walsh family. "This is about a dead Marine and a community that's demanding answers. Whatever I say or do is going to be scrutinized by everyone from veteran organizations to police unions to civil rights groups." "What did the family ask you to do specifically?" Sarah asked. "They want me to help them understand the investigation process, to advocate for transparency, and to work with both veteran groups and police departments to prevent similar tragedies. Basically, they want me to be a bridge between communities that are currently at war with each other." I could see the weight of the responsibility settling on Danny's shoulders. This wasn't about his own experience anymore, or even about general policy improvements. This was about a specific tragedy with real victims and legitimate grievances on multiple sides. "Do you think you're the right person for this?" I asked gently. I don't know, but I might be the only person both sides trust enough to have these conversations. Veterans know I understand military service and the challenges of coming home. Police departments know I'm not anti-law enforcement, that I'm trying to improve relationships rather than destroy them. What does your gut tell you? Danny was quiet for a long moment, weighing considerations I couldn't fully understand. My gut tells me that Kevin Walsh died because systems failed him, not because any individual person was evil or malicious. Military service, mental health care, law enforcement training, crisis intervention protocols, all of those systems had opportunities to prevent this tragedy and didn't. If I can help people focus on fixing systems rather than assigning blame, maybe something good can come from something terrible. Over the following weeks, Danny worked with the Walsh family, veteran advocacy groups, mental health organizations, and law enforcement representatives to develop a comprehensive response to the shooting. The process was painful and contentious, with each group bringing their own priorities and perspectives to discussions about what had gone wrong and how to prevent future tragedies. Danny's role was primarily to facilitate communication between groups that had stopped listening to each other, helping them find common ground around shared values like protecting vulnerable people and ensuring public safety. It required all of the diplomatic skills he'd developed through his advocacy work, plus emotional reserves he wasn't sure he possessed. The breakthrough came during a community meeting where Danny addressed an auditorium filled with veterans, police officers, mental health professionals, and the Walsh family. Instead of focusing on what had divided them, he talked about what they all wanted: a community where veterans in crisis received appropriate help, where police officers had the training and resources to handle mental health emergencies, and where tragedies like Kevin Walsh's death became impossible rather than inevitable. We can argue about what happened that night for years without bringing Kevin back or preventing the next tragedy, or we can work together to build systems that recognize mental health crises as medical emergencies, requiring medical responses, not criminal enforcement.
A year after the Walsh shooting, Danny was invited to speak at a national conference on veteran mental health, sharing the lessons learned from that painful but productive community process. His presentation focused on the importance of building bridges between different communities working on the same problems, and the potential for positive change, even in the aftermath of tragedy. Sitting in the conference audience, watching my brother address mental health professionals from across the country, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. What had started with a traffic ticket and an unexpected moment of recognition in a courtroom had evolved into a career dedicated to improving relationships between institutions and the people they served. Danny's work wasn't glamorous or particularly well paid, but it was meaningful in ways that traditional career success couldn't match. He'd found a way to use his military experience, his personal struggles, and his natural ability to communicate across different communities to make genuine improvements in other people's lives. More importantly, he discovered that service didn't end when you took off the uniform. The same qualities that had made him a good Marine, dedication to duty, willingness to sacrifice for others, commitment to doing what's right even when it's difficult, could be applied in civilian contexts to create positive change. That evening, at the conference dinner, Danny was approached by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Chen, a psychiatrist who worked with veteran populations. She thanked him for his presentation and mentioned that she'd been following his advocacy work for several years. "Your approach to building partnerships between different communities is exactly what our field needs more of," she said. "Too often we work in silos, with veteran organizations, law enforcement, mental health providers, and policymakers all addressing the same problems without coordinating our efforts." "It's frustrating," Danny agreed. "Veterans are falling through the cracks between systems that should be working together to support them. Would you be interested in discussing a potential collaboration? I'm part of a research initiative that's studying successful models for integrated veteran support services. Your work represents exactly the kind of cross-community partnership we want to promote nationally." Danny exchanged contact information with Dr. Chen,
but I could tell he was being cautious about taking on additional commitments. His advocacy work was personally fulfilling, but it was also emotionally demanding, requiring him to constantly navigate complex relationships and controversial issues. Later that night, in his hotel room, Danny called Sarah to update her on the conference and the potential research collaboration. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity," Sarah said, her voice coming through the phone speaker. "But how do you feel about it? Are you ready to take on something that big?" "I'm not sure. Part of me is excited about the possibility of influencing national policy around veteran services, but part of me worries about losing the personal connection that makes this work meaningful to me." "What do you mean?" "When I'm working with individual veterans or specific communities, I can see the direct impact of what I'm doing. People get help, relationships improve, problems get solved. Research and policy work is important, but it's more abstract. I'm not sure I'm ready to give up the hands-on aspects of advocacy." "Who says you have to give anything up? Maybe this is about expanding your impact rather than changing your focus." Sarah was right, of course. Danny had developed a rare combination of grassroots credibility and policy expertise that could be valuable at multiple levels. The challenge would be finding ways to remain connected to individual stories and community-level work while also contributing to larger systemic changes. 3 months later, Danny accepted a position as a senior fellow with Dr. Chen's Research Institute, a role that would allow him to continue his community-based advocacy work while also contributing to national studies on veteran transition and mental health services. The position came with a significant salary increase and opportunities to influence policy at the federal level. But what attracted Danny most was the chance to scale up the relationship-building work that had become his passion. His first project involved documenting successful partnerships between veteran organizations and law enforcement agencies, identifying common factors that contributed to positive outcomes, and developing recommendations for replicating those models in other communities. It was exactly the kind of work that combined Danny's practical experience with his growing understanding of how systems could be improved through collaboration rather than conflict. On the day Danny started his new position, I drove him to the Research Institute's offices in a modern building downtown. The environment was different from the community centers and VFW halls where he'd been doing most of his work, but I could see him already thinking about how to maintain his connections to the communities that had shaped his advocacy. "Nervous?" I asked as we pulled into the parking garage. "Excited, mostly. This feels like the next logical step in everything I've been working toward, but I want to make sure I don't lose sight of why I started doing this work in the first place." "Which was what?" "Making sure other people don't have to go through what I went through alone. Whether it's dealing with biased cops, or struggling with civilian readjustment, or facing mental health crises, veterans deserve support systems that actually work." As Danny headed into the building for his first day of work, I thought about the distance he had traveled from the isolated, angry young man who'd come home from Afghanistan, struggling to find his place in civilian life. That person was still part of who he was, but he'd learned to transform his pain into purpose, his experiences into expertise, and his individual struggles into opportunities to help others. The traffic ticket that had seemed such a disaster 3 years earlier had become the catalyst for everything meaningful that followed. Judge Martinez's decision to recognize Danny's service and dismiss the charges had created ripples that continued to spread, influencing police training programs, veteran advocacy initiatives, mental health policies, and countless individual lives. But the most important change had been in Danny himself. He'd learned that character wasn't just about individual actions or personal integrity, but about using your experiences and abilities to serve something larger than yourself. Military service had taught him about duty and sacrifice, but civilian advocacy had taught him about hope and the possibility of positive change. That evening, Sarah and I met Danny for dinner to celebrate his new position and to hear about his first day at the Institute. He was energized by the possibilities he'd discovered, the resources available for his work, and the potential for expanding his impact beyond individual communities. The best part, he said over dessert, is that they want me to keep doing the community-level work that I've been passionate about. This isn't about choosing between grassroots advocacy and policy research. It's about finding ways to connect them more effectively. "So what's next?" Sarah asked. "Next month, I'm traveling to 4 cities to document their veteran law enforcement partnership programs. After that, I'm presenting our preliminary findings to a congressional subcommittee on veteran affairs. And in between, I'm still doing police training sessions and speaking at veteran events." Danny paused, looking at both of us with an expression that reminded me of the determined young man who'd enlisted in the Marines almost a decade earlier. "For the first time since I got back from Afghanistan, I feel like I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. This work matters, and I'm good at it, and there's so much more that needs to be done." Driving home that night, I reflected on the journey my family had taken over the past few years. What had started as a simple traffic ticket had evolved into a story about justice, recognition, service, and the power of individual actions to create lasting change. Danny had found his calling. Sarah was building her own organization to help female veterans, and Judge Martinez had received recognition for her lifetime of service to justice and community. But beyond the individual success stories, there was something larger at work. All of them had discovered that their military service, including the difficult parts, could be transformed into tools for making civilian life better for other people. They'd learned that the same qualities that made someone a good soldier, dedication to duty, willingness to sacrifice for others, commitment to doing what's right even when it's difficult, could be applied in civilian contexts to create positive change. Danny's decision to carry Judge Martinez to safety in Afghanistan had echoed forward to save him in a California courtroom.
Judge Martinez's decision to recognize his service and dismiss the charges had created opportunities for him to help countless other veterans and improve relationships between communities that should be natural allies. That's the kind of story that changes how you think about coincidence and character and the invisible threads that connect all of our lives. It's the kind of story that makes you want to live with more integrity, to trust that the right thing is always worth doing, and to believe that individual actions can create positive change even when the benefits aren't immediately obvious. It's the kind of story that proves heroism isn't just about dramatic moments or exceptional circumstances, but about the daily choice to use your abilities and experiences in service of something larger than yourself. Sometimes that means carrying wounded officers to safety under enemy fire. Sometimes it means dismissing unjust charges in a traffic court. And sometimes it means spending your civilian career helping other people navigate the same challenges you've faced. All of it matters. All of it connects. And all of it started with 2 people choosing to do the right thing when they could have easily chosen otherwise. 5 years have passed since that morning in Judge Martinez's courtroom, and I'm standing in the same community center where Danny first spoke to police recruits, watching him receive a national award for his contributions to veteran advocacy and law enforcement reform. The audience is filled with faces that have become familiar over the years. Police chiefs who've implemented his training programs, veterans whose lives have been changed by his mentorship, mental health professionals who've adopted his collaborative approach to crisis intervention. Sarah sits beside me, now 7 months pregnant with their first child, her nonprofit organization having expanded to serve female veterans in 23 states. She wears the calm confidence of someone who's found her purpose and is building something lasting. Her success has been quieter than Danny's, less visible in news headlines, but equally transformative for the women she serves. Judge Martinez is presenting the award tonight, having retired from the bench last year to focus on judicial reform initiatives and veteran advocacy. At 71, she moves with the same purposeful energy she demonstrated in her courtroom, her commitment to justice as strong as ever, despite her official retirement from daily legal work. Danny Rodriguez represents the best of what public service can achieve, Judge Martinez says into the microphone, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spent decades in positions of responsibility.
He took a personal experience of injustice and transformed it into a nationwide movement for positive change. His work has improved relationships between law enforcement and veteran communities, saved lives through enhanced crisis intervention protocols, and demonstrated that individual actions can indeed create systemic improvements. Danny's acceptance speech focuses on the collaborative nature of the changes he's helped implement, crediting dozens of partners and allies who've contributed to improving veteran law enforcement relationships. His humility remains genuine despite the recognition he's received, reflecting the same character that led him to stay behind under fire to rescue a wounded officer years ago. After the ceremony, our extended chosen family gathers at a nearby restaurant for celebration dinner. The group includes Marcus Chen, who flew in from Seattle, where he now runs a veteran employment program, several police officials who've become genuine friends through their work with Danny, and Dr. Patricia Chen, whose research institute has documented the nationwide impact of collaborative veteran support programs. "What's next for you two?" Marcus asks Danny and Sarah over dessert, gesturing towards Sarah's growing belly. "Are you planning to slow down once the baby arrives?" Sarah and Danny exchange a look that communicates volumes about conversations they've had privately about balancing parenthood with their advocacy work. "We're planning to be more intentional about our choices," Sarah answers carefully. "Both of our organizations are established enough now that we can focus on sustainability rather than constant expansion. The baby changes our priorities, but it doesn't change our commitment to the work." Danny nods in agreement. "Being a parent means thinking about the world we're leaving for the next generation. That makes this work feel even more important, not less." Later that evening, as Sarah and Danny prepare to head home to pack for their honeymoon trip to Ireland, a vacation they've postponed 3 times due to work commitments, I find myself reflecting on the unexpected ways life can unfold. None of us could have predicted that a routine traffic stop would become the catalyst for career changes, new relationships, national recognition, and a growing family built around shared values of service and justice. "Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself," Danny tells me as we say goodnight in the restaurant parking lot. "I couldn't have done any of this without knowing you were always in my corner." "You did this yourself," I reply, meaning it completely. "I just had the privilege of watching you become who you were always meant to be." As I drive home alone, passing the courthouse where Judge Martinez first recognized Danny's service, I think about the invisible connections that shape all of our lives. 2 people choosing to do the right thing under pressure, years apart and thousands of miles away from each other, created a moment of recognition that changed everything that followed. Officer Thornton, I heard, through mutual acquaintances, left law enforcement 18 months after Danny's case and now works in private security. His harassment of Danny was the beginning of the end of his police career, but it was also the beginning of everything meaningful that came after. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become doorways to the best things, but only if we're willing to walk through them with character intact. The ripples from that courtroom moment continue to spread in ways large and small. Police academies teaching enhanced veteran interaction protocols, crisis intervention teams with specialized military cultural competency, veteran support networks that bridge the gap between military and civilian communities, and countless individual lives touched by people who learn to transform their pain into purpose. But the most important changes have been personal. Danny found his calling and his family. Sarah built an organization that changes lives every day. Judge Martinez discovered that retirement meant new opportunities for service rather than the end of meaningful work. And I learned that sometimes the best way to support someone you love is to stand witness to their transformation and celebrate their courage to become who they're meant to be. The story that began with a speeding ticket and seemed destined to end with injustice became instead a testament to the power of character, connection, and the choice to keep serving something larger than yourself long after you've taken off the uniform. It's the kind of story that reminds you why heroes come in all forms, why justice delayed isn't always justice denied, and why doing the right thing matters even when you can't see how it will benefit you. Most importantly, it's the kind of story that proves individual actions create lasting change, that service doesn't end when circumstances change, and that the bonds forged through shared commitment to something greater than ourselves can transcend time, distance, and the boundaries between military and civilian life. Sometimes the most profound victories happen not on battlefields or in dramatic moments, but in quiet courtrooms where justice finally prevails, in community centers where understanding replaces fear, and in the daily choice to use your experiences to make life better for people you may never meet. That's the kind of heroism that changes the world, one person, one relationship, one act of courage at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.